If you compare the amount that Copenhagen now has to spend each year on renewing its transport infrastructure with its compact city, bicycle and sustainable mass transit-based model, it's about 8% of their GDP per year. Compare that with Houston, sprawling car-based North American model, 14% of their GDP per year. So there's a huge saving through going down this route, but also there are other indirect benefits. In Copenhagen's case, they estimate that for every kilometre that is cycled, they save $1 in healthcare costs. You times that by 500,000 people cycling a number of kilometres a day, and you're starting to talk very big financial savings. Although I probably should say at this point, this cycling is not everybody's bag, and indeed a colleague of mine who works for an American mayor was doing a similar talk in the States when a Republican senatorial candidate for Minnesota stood up and said that he believed that bicycle lanes were a UN plot to bring in communism to America. So one has in some parts of the world some way to go convincing them that cycling is part of the long-term future for a successful future city. But of course it can only be part of the solution, and mass transit has to be at the very forefront of successful cities of the future. The big question, of course, is going to be how is that powered? I'm pretty convinced that electrification is going to be a major part of that. As long as the grid is decarbonised, then that will be a low-carbon solution for transport. But exactly how that is electrified is still out to question. The example on the screen here is one that I think will fly. Actually, it's something that's been implemented in Milton Keynes in the UK at the moment, but learning from Genoa and Turin. It's an induction charging system that means that vehicles that use the same routes consistently throughout the day, buses are the obvious example, can be recharged, their batteries can be recharged as they travel around the city through pads that are not dissimilar to the technology in your electric toothbrush. So whenever they stop at the bus stop, they get a quick recharge. It means you can reduce the battery capacity in the bus by 4/5, which is the biggest cost in an electric vehicle. And actually the aspiration in Milton Keynes is that the electric buses will be £10,000 to £12,000 a year cheaper than the conventional diesel buses that they're currently using. That pilot's about to start, and we'll wait and see how successful it is. One of the big things, of course, in shifting away from a car-based model to a mass transit, cycling, walking model is the way that helps you to change the design of the city. And this is a real before and after example from Seoul that actually, whilst it fits that agenda, the motivation in changing the city in this way was not actually about transport, it was about creating a sense of place in Seoul. So big, successful city, tremendous economic growth in the most recent period, but the city felt that there was no real heart to it. And it wasn't seen as a big world city because there was nowhere to go that people wanted really to see. So the last mayor but one took the extraordinary decision to rip out the 6-lane highway that ran through the centre of the city and uncover the stream underneath it, the Cheong Stream, which is now the major tourist attraction in the city, massively used by the local population. This is not an idealised vision with the number of people you see on there. Every time I've been there, it's chock-a-block with people using it as the place to go in their lunchtime. And it had a very welcome unintended consequence of reducing the ambient air temperature in what's quite a humid city, because now there's a flow of cool air going through the city rather than lots of hot car fumes. So that takes a hell of a lot of bravery, obviously. Don't expect it to be copied everywhere in the world, but it's an example of how a focus on placemaking can really change a city. But getting to that place where we're moving away from massive volumes of dirty, polluting, noisy traffic, replacing them quiet electric vehicles and cycling, allows you to change the way that you design buildings, more natural ventilation, less bulky facades to block out that noise and pollution. But there may be other things that we want to do with those facades that exist. And this is a project that's going to be launched in a couple of weeks' time in Hamburg, which Arup is involved with, part of an international design competition. And it's to create bioreactive facades for buildings. So this building will be using photosynthesis to grow algae on the facade of the buildings, simultaneously, because that microalgae will be mixed with water, simultaneously creating thermal energy through solar thermal, and the algae will be turned into methane gas through a biomass to create methane gas that will then provide energy for the building, indeed for the rest of the city. And I think it's an extraordinarily beautiful looking building which will change colour throughout the day in response to the photosynthesis process of the algae. Indeed, it could be different colours depending on the colour scheme that you want in the city. And it's a marvellous example, I think, of how buildings could be turned into power plants, because clearly sustainable cities are going to have to be a lot more self-reliant in energy, as in many other resources, and therefore they're going to have to use every piece of existing infrastructure to generate that, not having the space to put in massive new power generation facilities in most cities. And I think that provides an interesting sort of segue, that sort of thought about the connection between nature and buildings, with another big problem that I see looming for cities to grapple with is that notion of self-sufficiency, which is on the agenda in terms of energy and energy resilience, but we probably also need to be thinking about it in many of the other staples that cities relied on, most importantly of which is food. We see now in the number of increasing climate-related natural disasters when cities have major infrastructure closed off for a number of days and then realise actually there's only a day's food supply in the city. I think we'll see in the future much more of a move back to cities growing some of their own produce within the city, but also using that as a way to create natural floodplain, to create carbon sinks, and to create more green space for people to enjoy. This is probably the extreme. This is a city that hasn't yet been built, that's been designed in China, Wangzhang, where the design has been to make the city entirely self-sufficient in food within the geographical boundaries of the city. And indeed, it is a rewrite of an existing plan for the city that originally would have been destroying the existing 3,500 hectares of farmland and replacing it with a kind of concretised city. And instead, using the same geographical boundary, this plan has been able to incorporate all that agricultural production and more, because it's moved from monocrop culture to a mix of crops within the boundary of the city. Again, it's one we have to wait and see if it works, but it's a very exciting possibility. And coming to the last of the examples that I wanted to show, but sticking with the food for a moment, oysters. And if I've mainly concentrated on how cities need to do positive things to make themselves more sustainable and respond to climate change and other drivers. But of course, as Hurricane Sandy and other things have shown us very recently, one of the big things that many cities, most of which are the very big ones are coastal, have got to cope with, is the inevitable impacts of climate change now that we see that it's virtually impossible to avoid that 2-degree tipping point. New York has just been massively hit by Sandy, 50 billion costs and counting, extraordinary shutdown of the city. One of the things that they're looking at in response to that, obviously, is major engineering projects to protect themselves in the future, but it's also, through the Nature Conservancy, to restore oysters to the coast of New York. New York used to be known as the Big Oyster. The oyster beds were largely overexploited and then destroyed by industrial pollution. But it turns out that had the original oyster beds been there, the sort of hard bedrock that they would have given to the sea would have taken out some of the intensity of the hurricane. Not completely, but taken out some of it and protected New York. But they also serve an ecosystem service of taking the nitrates that run off from fertiliser from the surrounding agricultural lands into the water and destroy the marine population and the fisheries. So there's a dual benefit in starting to put back that natural capital. The big issue, of course, is who's going to pay for it, because there's a clear long-term benefit to the whole of the economy of New York, but the oysters themselves will have no value. The level of pollution still means they won't be available for sale as food. At the moment, it's being handled by a combination of the city and an NGO. And so I'll finish with a juxtaposition between the national and the city. And I'm really glad I had this slide in, because a comment Howard Smiley that Howard made in a previous meeting, which this is a real photograph from the Copenhagen Climate Summit, which was a total failure. And you can kind of see why it's a failure in the body language of the national leaders here. Their complete inability to work together to provide a common solution. Thankfully, what I see working around the world is a very different thing when one comes to city governments. This is one of many good city organisations, but one that we happen to work for, which is the C40. And here one sees a huge degree of collaboration on the issue of climate change and resource management between mayors, where they're trying to work together so they can all go at the pace of the fastest rather than what they can achieve within their own boundaries. And the truth is it's working. Again, from a survey that we did, when we looked at all the actions that the mayors had taken since the creation of the C40, we saw a steady escalation in activity to reduce carbon emissions. And in many, many cases, one could see a direct correlation between learning from each other. So London copying Paris and Lyon in having a bike hire scheme, and then that going to Mexico and other places. Every city in the C40 in Latin America now has a bus rapid transit scheme because they've seen it working in Curitiba and Bogota, and they want it in their own city. And a healthy attitude of seeing what works elsewhere, copying it, bringing it back home and calling it your own. And it will be your own because it will be changed in some subtle way that makes it unique to that city. So my conclusion is a positive one. I think there's enough examples of really good ways of getting towards being a sustainable future city around the world, that if they can be replicated in every city, means that we can start to create a positive future. And there is some hope at a city level that collaboration will happen. But cities do need to be empowered by their national governments and by intergovernmental institutions to make that more possible. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Mark. That was the last of nine sessions which have been organised this week by the Manchester Partnership. And nice sessions which I think we've worked really, really hard to actually do a number of things. One, communicate a real sense of integrated approach around some of the big challenges facing not just Manchester, but most cities. Secondly, actually provide some indication of how we're trying to respond to those challenges. And when you take all of that together, I think we provide a pretty compelling proposition that not only does Manchester understand the challenges, but Manchester has got the strategies, has got the capacity to actually meet those challenges successfully going forward. Mark actually made absolutely the right point at the end, that our ability to achieve our full potential is increasingly related to renewing relationships with government, so we have a much stronger toolkit to be able to determine our priorities, to be able to implement many of the initiatives which all of us want to promote. And I believe we've got the dialogue, the platform for being able to do that going forward. I'd like to thank all the Marketing Manchester team for the incredible job they've done for us this week. I found it intellectually stimulating. I hope all of you have found the experience a very positive one, certainly from the conversations I've had with people. I know Richard has had a number of conversations as well. Everyone's regarded this week as a resounding success. I'd like to thank my colleagues for the support they've given me and the Marketing Manchester team, and also increasingly our wide-ranging partnership for the contributions they've made to creating a very strong and powerful Manchester story. Thanks very much indeed.